Då hälsar vi hjärtligt välkomna hit igen till Svenska kyrkans monter och Se människans scenen. Vi fortsätter nu att knyta an till bokmässans tema jämställdhet och det blir ett panelsamtal här uppe under rubriken Sex och religion. Det är journalisten Gabriella Ahlström som kommer att leda samtalet som kommer att hållas på engelska. And we are pleased to welcome Nadia Bolz-Weber, JP Mokgethi Heath and Inti Chavez Perez. Most welcome och varsågoda.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And a warm welcome, I would like to say as well, to this extremely skilled panel. And we are going to discuss religion and sexuality. And we're going to discuss the need for a sexual reformation as it is presented in Nadia's latest book, Shameless, a sexual reformation. How come religions are so obsessed by sexuality and who we sleep with? Which are the consequences of such an obsession? And what does the Bible and the other sacred texts really say about human sexuality and love? There are some topics for our discussion today. But before we get started, I would like to introduce each of you more properly. JP Mokgethi Heath, you are Anglican priest, born in Namibia, and you have lived most of your life in Africa. But now you live in Sweden, where you work as a senior advisor on HIV, sexuality, and theology for ACT Church of Sweden. And you have developed training material as well as Bible studies around these very sensitive issues, and have also helped producing the current 4 books in the Human Dignity and Human Sexuality series. And next to you sits Nadia Bolz-Weber, a well-known face and name, I'm sure, for many in the audience. And you have written this Shameless, Sexual Reformation. This is your latest book, as I said, and besides being a best-selling writer and a speaker at international colleges and conferences around the globe, you're also the founder and the former pastor of House for All Sinners and Saints. And this is a Lutheran congregation in Denver in the US. And this congregation and its parishioners is of paramount importance in all your books and in this one as well. And we'll get back to that. Inti Chavez Perez, you are a sex educator and writer of the book Respect, Everything a Guy Needs to Know About Sex, Love and Consent, published by Penguin Books this fall. And you have also been appointed by the Swedish government as an expert on matters regarding the sexual violence of boys, LGBTQ issues, honor violence and more. As well as serving as a member of the Advisory Council for the Swedish Agency for Youth and Civil Society. Welcome all of you, as I said, a very skilled panel, and you showed your book as well, Inti. Very good. But Nadia, first of all, maybe you could tell us some more about the House for All Sinners and Saints, because it has a big importance for this book. And I was just curious about when you started this congregation, what was your intention doing that? And in what way does this congregation differ from other religious communities in the US?
Well, first of all, the origin of the congregation was just, there were 8 people in my living room. I mean, I knew they were there. It wasn't creepy or anything, but I'm trying to say it started with just me and 8 people in my house, and trying to figure out what it looked like to be to have a sort of expansive theological imagination while still being deeply rooted in tradition. And it just so happened that 4 of the 8 people were members of the GLBTQ community, and so the DNA of the congregation was very queer. And I wanted to start a church that I felt that I would feel comfortable in. Most churches that I visit, they're perfectly friendly, but I feel like I have to culturally commute from who I am to who the church is. I have to watch my humor and my language and maybe not talk about certain parts of my story. And there's just a vibe that doesn't really feel very comfortable to me, so I'm a little on edge the whole time. So I wanted to create a Christian community that was really deeply liturgical, but that people could feel relaxed in. They can bring all of themselves, all of their story, all of their doubts or beliefs or some mixture of both into that space and feel very much at home. And part of the way I think we accomplish that is we say we're anti-excellence, pro-participation. So when people even come to the service, the first thing you're asked is, do you want to help lead part of the liturgy? So we reserve all the jobs for the liturgy for people just walking in, whoever wants them. So you could have never gone to a Christian worship service in your life and be asked if you want to read the gospel or serve communion, or do you want to do one of the prayers? So that is welcoming, like to say to people, we trust you with the holy things just because you walked in. You don't have to be deemed worthy. You're just here and that's enough. And so I think a lot of times churches don't understand the difference between being friendly and being welcoming. And we tried to create a space that was welcoming. But there was still clearly a priest. Like, I still said the words of institution and preached. But everything else, people could participate in if they chose to.
And Shameless, this book, is described as a journey of holy resistance. And would I say with an aim to heal wounds afflicted on people by church and by religion, and instead reach for a new Christian ethic free from shame and oppression? Or speaking about your language, Nadia, as you choose to express it yourself in the book, and I quote you, I'm saying, let's burn in the fuck down and start over because it's time. And I think that is a good starting point for this discussion as well, with the idea of a new reformation. And I would like to start to ask you, JP, when reading Nadia's book, what were the thoughts that came into your mind and your reflections?
My first encounter with the book was really to see it as a book which flowed from a deeply pastoral encounter. It was clear that your engagement over coffee with your parishioners, the discussions that you had there, the place that you found that space for counseling and for care was the core of the book. And the language and the style in which you write it was exactly that. It was very pastoral. And it engaged on the issues that touched the woundedness that faith and institutional religion had effected on people. So I found it very moving from that perspective.
I mean, there is this thing in religion that you should look at the fruits of things. Like, what fruit is it bearing? And so I think what I tried to do was to say, what fruit is the teachings of the church around sexuality actually bearing in people's lives? Is it helping people or is it hurting people? And I just had this curiosity, and I asked my parishioners who would be willing to go to coffee with me and tell me, what message did you receive from religion about sex and the body and gender? And how did those messages affect you in your life? And then how have you navigated your adult life since then? And I was shocked at how ready people were to answer those questions. I was almost shy in asking them, thinking it was too much, and they wanted to be asked. And so I think it might be a good practice in religion to say, hey, we're so into these doctrines and these teachings. Have we showed any curiosity about the effect of them on people's lives, good or bad? Because I'm like, hey, if the teachings of the church are harming the people, we rethink the teachings. We don't alienate the people. And so I'm like, we should never be more loyal to an idea or a doctrine or an interpretation of a Bible verse than we are to people. And I think that's sort of the premise of the book in a way.
And Inti, I would like to ask you, all these things that are hurting people, and people are talking and telling you about, Nadia, in the book. For example, the idea of sexual purity, no sex before marriage, dangers of masturbation, homosexuality. Considering Sweden being more of a secular country, at least if you compare it to the US, to what extent do you believe that these things are true also for people here? I know that you see a lot of teenagers, and what do they tell you about?
Well, I would say that, yes, these ideas also affect teenagers in Sweden. We are not as secular as the image of Sweden implies. Sweden is a multi-religious country where, of course, the Swedish church is very progressive and has done lots of reformation, like having female priests and so on. And it wasn't easy because there was also resistance inside the Swedish church. But there's not only the Swedish church, we also have the evangelical groups, and those are quite US inspired. I hear people tell me stories that for me seem very American, like the story of the apple. There's a pastor, and he says, okay, we take this apple and think that this apple is your body, and now every guy in this room takes a bite on this apple, and then when everybody took a bite of the apple, then give this apple to the man that this woman is going to marry. Okay, so it devalues then her body and also her humanity as a gift to the groom.
There's also the one with the flower, where they take a flower and they pluck, every boy plucks a petal off, and then there's just a withered stem that goes to her husband, and it's always the girl. I have never heard of people saying, oh, there was an illustration where every time a boy has sex with a girl, you know, part of him is consumed away or sort of withered, and then his wife gets some withered stem. It's always the girl.
Exactly, and that's a bit what I work, because I work a lot with boys, and we do have this very negative image of male sexuality, that male sexuality is something destructive or dark. So many boys actually do believe that when they have sex with a girlfriend, that they stain her, because that's the idea, that we have the female and she is pure, and then we have the man, and his sexuality, it comes with all the darkness and all the stain. So it is, in a way, it's not only degrading of the female, but also if you start thinking about it, it gives you lots of negative ideas as a boyfriend or spouse, husband, what you can give to your partner.
So we can agree on that religion and sex is very much linked together in different ways. But why this obsession, one might ask? And Nadia, you asked that in the beginning of the book, and you got a really intriguing explanation, an explanation that kind of got you going and gave you the idea of writing this book. Maybe you can just tell us about this episode.
Well, it was very personal, that I was, there's a policy in my denomination in the States, the Lutheran Church. You have to sign a document that says that you'll be faithful in marriage or celibate in singleness. And when I was married when I signed it, and I'm ashamed to say I never really looked into the history of that document. It was actually established to keep gay people out of the pastorate, is the origin of it. But anyway, I didn't think much about it. But I was married to a very good man who I actually have a great deal of respect for, but we never connected in our marriage the way either of us needed. And so it was an extremely lonely marriage, and we were just roommates who co-parented. And the church seemed not concerned because neither of us slept with other people. But there didn't seem to be a concern for what effect does it have on somebody's heart and on their body and on their spirit to be in a sexless marriage and to have that part of them just shut down. And then when we went through a very friendly divorce with each other, and then when my boyfriend and I got together, everything sort of ignited in me. It felt like an exfoliation of my whole spirit. Like it softened who I was. I was a better pastor. I was more sort of present to people. I had more joy in my life. And I was like, why did the church make me sign a document saying I wouldn't do this? Like, how is it better for my congregation if I'm not getting laid? Like, that made no sense to me. And so my boyfriend's a heathen. He's not Christian. And I was on tour supporting the UK in the German edition of my last book. And I was on the road, and I just had this urgency about this question. And I said, can we hop on Skype? And I just said right away, like, why do you think the church has tried to control sex for so long, when clearly it can be this amazing thing, and it's been an amazing thing in my life? And without skipping a beat, he said, I always assumed the church saw sex as its competition. And I was like, oh, I'm writing a book. Like, I was supposed to be writing a different book. But that's what sort of started the process. And then I went home and asked people to do those interviews with me. And carrying those stories that I received from people about the harm that the teachings of the church had done on their bodies and their spirits and their lives was so heavy. And so this is sort of a pastoral letter to them, I think, more than anything. I'm not a systematic theologian or a sex educator, you know, but I'm a pastor. So you were right about that, yeah.
And JP, you have studied and you have written books about how sexuality is regarded in the sacred text of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And would you say that this view of sexuality being in competition with religion is true for other religions as well? And can you say something more about the similarities on the religious views on sex between these religions? I know that is a kind of complex and broad question.
I think that the one thing that I can say without fear of contradiction is that the sacred texts, not only of the Abrahamic faiths, but also of the karmic faiths, would not condemn sexuality in the way in which we do in Christianity. And much of that negativity towards sexuality has been through the interpretation that we have of Scripture. And Christianity has had a massive impact on those other faiths in terms of how they see sexuality today. I want to give a Swedish example, and you're going to have to forgive me for my pronunciation if it's not perfect, but masturbation in Swedish is called onani, is that right?
Yeah.
Onani. It's the sin of Onan. Genesis chapter 38. There's no masturbation in Genesis chapter 38. None whatsoever. But the way in which the encounter between Onan and Tamar is interpreted suggests that when he has coitus interruptus, when he withdraws himself and spills the seed on the side, that's described as masturbation. Someone did not understand masturbation. That is not masturbation. And yet...
It's the sin of not understanding masturbation.
So even within a Swedish context, the way in which that text has been read and the name that is given for masturbation is so badly read.
Yeah, but I have a question, because in the Christian text, it just feels to me that Hellenistic thinking that's Platonic, that the spirit is good and the flesh is bad, that dualism that exists in Greek thought. A lot of times Christianity could have run in one of two directions. It could have gone in a more Hebraic sense and had been more incarnational, or it could have gone and been more Greek. And it went Greek. And so I feel like a lot of these struggles that we've had in terms of sexuality and Christianity, it's not really Paul, it's Plato. I mean, do you agree with that?
Absolutely, because Judaism is very sex positive. It's very sex positive. I think I could go further and say that the New Testament in itself is not sex negative. Augustine is sex negative. Tertullian is sex negative. And so the doctrine of original sin, which is then developed by St. Augustine in the 3rd century, that is what has dominated Christian thought and negatively impacted us.
It's not even the text. Like if you say, tell me, if we went around the room and I said, tell me the Garden of Eden story, people would talk about maybe temptation and Satan and original sin and a fall from grace and literally none of those are in the text. Not one of those words is in the text. Yes. It's all Augustine.
Yeah, indeed.
And I would say also, and poor Augustine, because he loved a woman and had a child with her, but his mother would not accept this woman as his wife because she wasn't pure enough and Christian and so on. And so orchestrated by her mother, Augustine broke the relationship with his beloved woman, and actually was planning to marry a teenager, she was really young teenager. Fortunately, that didn't end up in the end. But I would say, poor him. I don't think that kind of teaching leads to a good life, and you can see it in his own life, but it does not work. Didn't work 2,000 years ago, will not work today.
Yeah, I just don't think we should take one guy's hang-ups about stuff and then say, this is the word of the Lord for all people. I'm like, really? It feels like it might be one guy's shit. I have compassion for it. It came out of pain, and it came out of really bad theology, but I don't think that just because he was the first to sort of write down stuff about the Garden of Eden, that now we have to take that as the word of God. And I also think a lot of his writings were quite beautiful and totally worthy of being retained.
So it's a matter of going to the core in this sacred text and make them or read them more as helpful than shameful. You would say.
And even, there is that beautiful erotic poem in the Bible, the Song of Songs, beautiful erotic poem that's written largely in a female voice, where she is unashamed about her sexual desire for her lover, who she's not married to. And of course, what were people taught this was about? Oh no, it's not about sexual desire. It's not about an eroticism. It's about Jesus' love for the church, which is completely irrational, right? But where do we get that interpretation from? Oh, it was this dude named Origen who was so terrified of sexual temptation, he castrated himself. Okay, that's terrifying. Also, is that the guy we want to listen to about this? This is like the reliable source of wisdom around sexuality? Somebody who cut his balls off? I'm just suggesting perhaps not.
So maybe time runs so fast here, but maybe we can just shortly move from the theology to the more personal experiences. And I'm just curious about what religious messages you were brought up with and raised with, and how you managed to kind of break free from them. If you can just say something short about that, Inti, and yes, please.
I was raised Catholic, and that meant that we did not speak about sex, and I didn't really quite understand how the body worked. So that made me a curious person, and that also, I think, opened up for me to wanting to study the body and sexuality, and later on I became a sex educator. I think it's because of my Catholic upbringing. I also usually say, because when I meet teenagers, they have a very stereotypical idea of what it means to be religious, what it means to have a faith, because they think you have to buy the whole concept. And so people say, but you're not a true Catholic, okay? And what I say is that, when I was a kid, I didn't have a choice. People told me I was a Catholic. I didn't have a choice if I was going to church or not. Or I didn't have a choice, to analyze the scripture or anything. And today I do. I am an adult and I do have the skills and can take responsibility for it. So today nobody can take that away from me. So I was a child, then I was a Catholic. Well, now you have to stand out with me, because now I'm going to be a Catholic. And like everything I do is another way of being a Catholic, even though it's not how the Pope would see it.
And JP, what was it like for you?
I was brought up first in Namibia in the Dutch Reformed Church, or as we later called it, the much deformed church. Well, I mean, they did manage to write a doctrine of apartheid, so you can see they were a little messed up. But within that church, it was very strict Calvinistic, and sex was not something that was talked about at all. Pleasure was not talked about. Laughter was against the law of the church, as it were, you know, anything. So one of these images that we have within the Afrikaner culture that I was raised in to talk about the sexual relationship between a husband and wife is that they sit down for dinner at night. The wife serves the dinner. After she's cleared away the dinner, then the husband will raise his eyes and say, "Mother," and she'll say, "Yes, Father." And that's, "Tonight we're having sex." So, and you know, very passionful. You can hear that. So because sex was functional, it was procreational, you know, there was no pleasure in it. So there was no purpose for it between people who are same-sex, because what purpose is there in that? Because pleasure has no place in it. So that's what I was brought up with. And it was really not until I entered into my first relationship of intimacy that I found that my body had purpose. And that as I could embrace someone in love and tenderness, that released me for a different level of ministry in my parish. So my parishioners benefited from my private intimacy because I was able to be intimate in a different way with them.
Thank you. Just short, we just have to finish soon, but when you listen to JP and Inti's stories, Nadia, is it like the stories that you usually hear as a pastor at the house? This kind of stories?
Yeah, I mean, the stories I heard were, a lot of them were very heartbreaking. And one of the things that was very common, because most of my parishioners were raised really evangelical, they weren't raised in progressive religion at all, that a lot, and in what's called the purity culture in America. So a lot of them were told as teenagers that in order to be pleasing to God, in order to be in right relationship with God, it's very important that you don't think sexual thoughts, that you don't masturbate, that you don't lust after other people, that you have no sexual contact with anyone at all. And so right when their bodies are beginning to sort of weave themselves together in a really particular way, becoming sexually mature, right when God developed our bodies to be doing that, the church said, yeah, it's like God put a sort of programmed a passive-aggressive test of our willpower into creation, that your bodies are going to naturally do this, but if you love me, you won't think about it, you won't see movies where there's sexual images, you won't date, none of this. And so, so many of us have this desire to be good in us. And that's the thing that's preyed upon so often in really abusive situations, is our desire to be good. And they desired to be good, and they did what the church told them, and they waited, and they didn't have sex, and they had all this shame, and they would feel horrible. If they masturbated, they'd feel like God was judging them, all of this horrible stuff. And then later in life, when they thought, I don't even believe that anymore, or maybe when they did finally get married and they were in a relationship they felt it was okay to be sexual in, they were left trying to connect frayed wires. They could not have that sort of flourishing. You can't go from thinking of sex as sinful and dangerous and naughty to flipping a switch on the day of your wedding and think of sex as joyful and God-given and free and beautiful and pleasurable. They couldn't do it. And so I heard so many stories of people not having flourishing in their own sex lives because of programming from when they were young that continued to damage them even when they stopped believing in it.
We could be sitting here for the rest of the afternoon and the night as well, and I'm sure the audience agree, but you have to stop now. And it's been so interesting listening to you, and the three of you are just three remarkable examples of, doing these courageous journeys and being yourself. So thank you so much, and thank you, audience, as well.